Hi, welcome to SPU's Immerse Academy 2021. My name is Dr. Diana Keuss, and I will be speaking to you in a short three-part lecture series under the broad topic of missiology. But in particular, I would like to introduce you to the idea of a theology of religions. And taking that idea, I'd like to develop that toward a theology of hospitality in the second installment. And then thirdly, develop that toward some comments on inter-religious dialogue. So that's where we're going in this three-part series. I have also subtitled my whole presentation, the whole three-part series, as Love God, Love Neighbor, and you will be familiar with this greatest commandment as Jesus reminds us from Matthew 22. When asked, what is the greatest commandment? He says, love the Lord your God with all your heart and your soul and your mind. And then he says the second commandment is just like this. I'd like you to think of that in your mind. Love your neighbor as yourself. So that's our subcontext for this three-part talk. So let's get started with a theology of religions. Christianity grew from its small minority status to become the dominating religious culture in Western society. From the very beginning, Christians have believed that the message of God's love, manifested through Jesus Christ, is the message to be shared, and we call this sharing missiology. The encounter between Christians and the rich and diverse spiritualities of the world, however, has affected Christianity in terms of shaping it culturally itself. My example for this cultural shaping comes from Vincent Donovan's work with the Maasai tribe in Tanzania. He was a missionary there, and when the Maasai converted to Christianity, he watched as, and in fact, he writes this text, Christianity Rediscovered, as he rediscovers what he understood as Christianity, reimagined and practiced in ways that he never saw, didn't pre-see. He talks about this idea of passing the peace. He introduced this idea of passing the peace before you start in the Eucharist meal and take communion. And the Maasai tribe, being very communally oriented, took this idea and incorporated it in terms of walking from house to house, passing the peace literally throughout the entire village. And if they got to one house in which one person had a problem with another person, they had a dispute, and they were not able to reconcile it on the spot, literally the Eucharist meal or the communion meal would be stopped and it would not proceed. So nobody would take communion that day. I think, in the Western culture, we sometimes we pass the peace, but knowing, I still have problems with this person or that person. Here, this passing of the peace became one of the precursors towards sharing that Eucharistic meal. I share this story just to exemplify this idea that as Christianity moves into other cultures, as it encounters other cultures, it will be culturally shaped and formed and reinterpreted even through different eyes. And so this encounter of Christianity with non-Christian religions, and often in a missiology or missiology context, has generated a new new concern or a new context for theological investigation. And this is what we call theology of religions, particularly in the 20th century. It has become insufficient to consider the world's religions as void of meaning and value. Literally pre-20th century, it was Christianity and then pagan religions, something that had no value, no context. It was just other and kept that way. This exchange the growth of knowledge, Christianity going into other countries, into China, into African nations, and learning about the culture, reading the ancient texts has generated new or renewal of understanding. And so, what is a theology of religions? It is basically how Christians evaluate or look at the possibility of meaning and value in non-Christian religions. Veli-Matti Karkkainen here has a nice, concise definition. He says, theology of religions is that discipline of theological studies which attempts to account theologically for the meaning and value of other religions. A Christian theology of religions attempts to think theologically about what it means for Christians to live with people of other faiths and about the relationship of Christianity to other people. Let me make a few observations about, first of all, the title Theology of Religions. Note that plurality of religions. It's not just Christianity and religion, as if religion could, sum up all other belief systems. Religions, we take the reality of the plurality of our religious context of this world very seriously, and theologians do as well. And that plurality, I want to just kind of point out that, Francis Clooney, another Jesuit theologian, he has mentioned that all theology is interreligious. All theology is interreligious. In other words, a Christian having a conversation with another Christian, that dialogue will be interreligious. Why? Because we have a great diversity of views and interpretations, right, of texts. And I mean, I could list a whole number, beginning with baptism, that we have different interpretations, different groups of Christians interpret it differently. Their practices are developed around their interpretation. So just to understand that there's a great diversity of understanding within the Christian religion. This is true of all other world religions that you will go on if you go on to study other religions. There are Pure Land Buddhists and Tibetan Buddhists, and beyond that as well. There are Hindus who are Vaishnavites. They worship Vishnu as the supreme god, and there are Hindus who are Shaivite. They worship Shiva as the primary God or manifestation of God. And then, of course, there are those who worship the goddess. So what we are noticing here, theology of religions, is that there's a great diversity of interpretation and practice. Also, there's another word, and I don't have it on this screen here, but it's the word pluralism. We live in a pluralistic society, and this is just a simple description of the world's of the world that we live in. That world used to be, primarily American Christian and primarily, let's say, Japan Buddhist, for example, or Shinto. But we have now noticed that plurality entering our own context. So right here in the Northwest, I can talk about the plurality of religions. I'm living on a street. I can look out my window right now, and I can say, I know that this my neighbor right here worships at the Hindu temple. So Hindu, I don't know if they're Shaivite or Vaishnavite. But and then my next door neighbor down that way is Buddhist. So I have a great diversity of religions right here in my own context. That is simply an observation. We live in a pluralistic society. The word pluralism has another context when we talk about theology of religions, because it becomes a marker or a typology. Let me address that in the next slide. Okay, so there are a number of questions that arise from a Christian theology of religions, and I'm getting just this smallish list from Gavin DaCosta. who has outlined a few of the pertinent questions. So, for example, under what circumstances may individuals experience salvation apart from the witness of the church? And here's where you perhaps have encountered some of the typological categories that people refer to themselves or others. And I don't know how helpful these categories are in terms of naming others, right? Are we creating more divisions? However, there is, and you should know, a great, a wide perspective of theological approaches, ranging from very exclusivist. You might have heard that term, exclusivist, like salvation is exclusively found through the vehicle of the church, as was established in the early biblical text, and as that moves out into the world, this is part of the church's responsibility. So that exclusively salvation is found in the church. Then you might have heard the term inclusive, like yes, the church obviously is teaching, is sharing Jesus into the world, but there are other. There are other movements, the movement of the Holy Spirit, for example. There are other ways in which people are hearing about God and experiencing God. And so inclusively, who knows? God's working in God's world, and we're working in our way, and God's revealing God's self in perhaps a multiplicity of ways. Then there's, on the other end of the spectrum, something, maybe you've heard the term pluralist, and that's where I was trying to draw the distinction earlier here. A pluralist believes that all avenues or all religions are just different ways in which God is leading people to God's self. In other words, underneath the diversity of theologies and different perspectives on religion, that there's some kind of unity underneath, and so that's would be a pluralist viewpoint. And again, I'm not certain how important making these distinctions are for yourself, but just to know that there is a wide gamut of theological perspectives. Another question: to what extent and on what basis can one recognize elements of truth and goodness in non-Christian religions? For example, engaged Buddhism, a fairly 19th and 20th century movement within Buddhism, has recognized the social importance of our connectivity. And there's a very old teaching within Buddhism that says that we are all interconnected. In fact, we are interdependent is the word they use. What I do here in my little corner of the Northwest might literally have repercussions for others around the country and beyond that, off to the world. If I cut down a forest, if I pollute a stream, those are ecological repercussions. But if I take care of a neighbor or help a refugee get resettled here, those are other repercussions I may not have any view or sight of, but they have repercussions through time and space. So does a Buddhist perspective, can that give me any a wider perspective of what does it mean to love my neighbor, for example? So that's a question, and again, disputed by theologians, and there's a wide gamut of answers to that. Another question: to what extent, if any, is the triune God active in non-Christian religions? And I've already touched on this, but we talk about the Holy Spirit moving where the Spirit will move. Is there a way in which I can know or should know how God is working within this world? So one of the questions becomes, how do I live my Christian faith in a way that is open to the movement of the Holy Spirit? Another question here: to what extent can one incorporate non-Christian practices into the development of indigenous churches in missionary contexts? And we've already taken a look at that question when we talked about Donovan's experience in Tanzania with the Maasai tribe, and his, his opening of his mind that perhaps the practices um, can be reinterpreted. There are other contexts as well. In Japan, there's the large question of uh, of the deep honor and respect given to ancestors. I respect my ancestors that gave me the opportunity to live here and now and take on this life. And how can one respect ancestors, not worship, but how can one respect them in a Christian context? This is something that I had a conversation when I was in Japan with an Episcopal priest who said this was a very pertinent and very important question for Christians to consider as they do the work of speaking to Japanese about the Christian faith. To ignore ancestors is an anathema to a Japanese culture. So this cultural context, what is a way in which the culture can expose and maybe explicate aspects of Christianity that we haven't seen through our cultural lens that we are approaching Christianity from. So I hope that you see that within these questions, and by taking a look at the theology of religions, in fact, Christianity is enriched, and our perspectives can widen as we take a look at the interactions between Christians, other religions, other cultures. So the activity that I'd like you to consider after this short talk is one of journaling. The first question I'm asking you here is to list out 5 things that are most important to you, and you can think of aspects of your faith. You can think of aspects of your faith community and how you're integrated in that. You can think of aspects of your faith walk and the activities that you do. You can think of family aspects, your schooling, your ambitions. What are these 5 things that are so important to you, and why? Like, reflect a little bit on why are these important to you. Also, I'd like you to list out 3 to 5 questions that you have or responses to this talk in particular, questions that arise from a theology of religions, questions that arise from an intercultural context, or just responses. Perhaps you have your own experience or experience of intercultural connections and sharing that you'd like to bring out. So I'd like to see that in a journal entry, and we will move on then to our next lecture. Bye for now.